Attention! These tapes have been recorded in the extended play mode. It may be necessary to adjust the tracking on your VCR for optimum picture quality.
The lectures you're about to see cover the last 3,000 years of Western intellectual history. They cover most of the important problems in Western thought and high culture, and they will involve a kind of thinking that most people don't spend most of their time doing. It's called philosophy. The word philosophy comes from two Greek words, the words for love and wisdom, or knowledge. And philosophy is more or less a love of wisdom, a sort of passion for knowledge, which goes beyond what we can get from it, which goes beyond practical concerns. And the intellectual tradition of the West forms a more or less coherent philosophical tradition with a common set of problems, a roughly similar set of issues under consideration, and a similar set of vocabulary words that we use to inquire into philosophical topics. And we might as well consider these vocabulary, this set of terms that we use now, in order to prevent misapprehensions later on. In the first case, we're going to talk about physics and metaphysics. Physics might be thought of as our theory of nature. And roughly speaking, what it means is it's our way of explaining the world around us, the world of sense perception, the world of tables and chairs and of the component parts of tables and chairs, and of the larger things that we encounter, suns, galaxies, worlds, things like that. Our general theory of the world of space and time around us might be described from a philosophical standpoint as being physics. Another set of philosophical issues, another philosophical problem or topic that comes along with our consideration of physics is metaphysics. Metaphysics comes from Greek words meaning above or beyond physics or nature. What we mean by metaphysics is a set of ideas or entities that exist independently of the world of space and time, that aren't the kind of things that tables and chairs and rocks and stars are. Examples of metaphysics are pure ideas, or spiritual entities like God or the angels, things like that for religious believers. In every case, though, metaphysics suggests that there's something to the world, that there's something real and existing that exists independent of and somehow outside of our immediate everyday experience. So metaphysics is the inquiry and the consideration of things that exist outside of nature itself, pure ideas and religious objects of religious thought. In addition to physics and metaphysics, we'll also be considering two related questions, ontology and logic. Now, ontology is not the kind of word you're going to see on an everyday basis. It's not the kind of thing you're most likely going to find in the newspaper. But ontology is not a terribly hard thing to comprehend. It's speech about beings. In other words, ontology is a kind of philosophical discipline which allows us to analyze and think about the kind of existence that things have. For example, we might say that God exists in a different way and on a different plane from everyday human beings. We might be inclined to say that human beings have a status and a set of rights and a kind of dignity that everyday objects don't have. In other words, when we distinguish between human beings and physical objects, or between God and human beings, we're making what might be called ontological distinctions. We're distinguishing between the kinds of beings that they are. We're attributing to them different status in a sort of hierarchy, perhaps, and we're distinguishing the kind of speech that we can make about them, the kind of reasoning that we can do about them, and the kind of thing that they are. There are differences in the way we apprehend different ontological classes of beings. So ontology is just going to be speech about beings. It sounds simple early on. It won't be too bad. I'll come back to this topic of ontology later because it's pregnant with many important philosophic questions. In addition to ontology, we're going to talk about logic a little bit. Logic is a kind of formidable term. It's a little bit intimidating when you first encounter it. It's nothing quite as complicated as you might think. Logic is a system of rules for deriving true inferences. In other words, logic is a series of rules which says that if you start out with true premises, if you follow the rules of logic, you will always draw true inferences. So it's nothing very complicated, nothing as intimidating as you might have suspected. Logic is just a set of rules for organizing our thinking so that we always get the right answer if we start out with true assumptions. It's not as bad as you might have thought. Well, in addition to questions of logic and ontology, we also have questions of epistemology. Now, epistemology, another large kind of intimidating word, but it's simpler than you might suspect. It comes from two Greek words, episteme and logos, meaning speech or reasoning about knowledge itself. When we inquire into epistemology, what we're doing is thinking about knowledge, trying to account, first of all, for what sort of things we can know about, and second of all, we're trying to account for what kind of knowledge we can have of different kinds of things. So, for example, our knowledge of arithmetic may be different from our knowledge of the boiling point of water. Our knowledge of the boiling point of water may be different from our knowledge of right and wrong. Our knowledge of right and wrong may be different from our knowledge of political theory or the way that governments ought to be organized. In every case, different kinds of knowledge and different kinds of thinking involve epistemological distinctions and epistemological thinking. It involves thinking about thinking. When philosophers do this, they are trying to clarify their own thoughts and clarify the thoughts of other people to eliminate confusions that have crept into people's thinking by providing a specific and detailed analysis of how thinking works, what thinking can do, and then giving examples of the appropriate sort of thinking. So all through this long series of lectures that we're going to be doing on the history of Western philosophy, questions of epistemology will be central to our concerns. And when you hear the word epistemology, it's nothing to get excited about. The philosopher in question is just doing a little thinking about thinking. He's just doing a little talk about what it means to be reasonable, about what it means to think clearly. In addition to talking about epistemology, every philosophy that talks about knowledge also has to talk about a theory of the knower, because whenever there's knowledge, there's also some person doing the knowing. And a theory of knowledge and a theory of the knower always lead to a sort of philosophical psychology. Either explicitly or implicitly, all of the philosophers in the Western tradition have a particular conception of the human mind and the human consciousness, which is characteristic of and cognate to their entire philosophical project. Different sorts of philosophical psychologies, different conceptions of the mind, will be characteristic of different philosophers and will come to light when we have different kinds of questions to consider. Plato had one particular philosophy of mind, and he organized his philosophy of mind or of the soul with particular reference to the problems of justifying mathematical knowledge. The philosophers of the 17th and 18th century, who were at the heyday of the rise of modern science, put together different and alternative conceptions of philosophical psychology based upon different concerns with regard to epistemology. Their concerns in the 17th and 18th century were primarily with justifying the rise of modern natural science, and their philosophy of mind correspondingly differs in the sort of emphasis that they place upon different topics. Beyond the philosophy of mind, we're also going to have three related disciplines. And the first will be aesthetics. What we mean by aesthetics is a theory of the beautiful, a series of reasoned conclusions or reasoned thoughts about what it is that human beings find beautiful, whether this beauty that they apprehend is in the object that they're looking at or observing, or whether it's in the psyche, whether it's in the mind itself, and what the role of beauty is in the rest of our judgments, for example, in our judgments of right and wrong, our judgments of political order and change, and our judgments of the way that we ought to live our own particular lives. Aesthetics will be a way of formalizing and making rigorous our everyday, perhaps odds and ends, not terribly well organized feelings about beauty. Aesthetics brings together our series of common everyday thoughts about what's beautiful and attractive and formulates them into a philosophical whole that connects them to other philosophical questions like ethics, ontology, epistemology. Two other philosophic topics or philosophic questions will be discussed repeatedly in the course of these lectures on the history of philosophy. The first is ethics, and the second is politics, or more precisely, political theory. Ethics is the theory, or the philosophic branch of inquiry, which talks about right and wrong, which talks about our moral obligations, which inquires into our certainty of what we ought and ought not to do. Ethics asks, what is it to be a human being and to engage in actions that are appropriate to a human being? How can we improve the way we behave, and how can we make adequate or satisfactory judgments of the behavior of other people? Ethics investigates the part of human beings that are not animals, that are not specifically, completely part of nature. It investigates the element in human beings which make choices, which are free, which in the ancient intellectual tradition have souls. Ethics inquires into the sort of activities we undertake, the sort of judgments of value that we make, and the sort of people we are or could become. Now, connected with these concerns is the philosophy of politics, or political theory. The reason why politics is connected to ethics is because, at least in the ancient tradition of politics and ethics, one is directly connected to the other because the city, or the human collectivity, is seen as being like an individual human soul, only raised in size, increased in proportions. So if it is true that the human individual is like human society in some respects or for some purposes, then at its basis, political theory, the theory of political science, the theory of how we ought to organize societies, of how governments ought to be organized, of how justice ought to be dispensed, will all be connected with our theories of ethics and with our conceptions of proper human behavior. In other words, both ethics and politics investigate the theory of what is good or what is righteous. Ethics investigates what is good or righteous at the level of the individual. Politics investigates what is good or righteous or praiseworthy or justifiable at the level of society. So at the level of the individual, ethics tells us what we ought to do. At the level of society, political theory or political science or political philosophy will investigate the way societies are organized, the way they ought to behave, the kind of laws they ought to create, and the kind of political order, the kind of connections between human beings they ought to establish and justify. So the concerns of the history of philosophy are remarkably small given the vast variety of thinkers in the history of philosophy, the enormous diversity and richness of the traditions they represent, and the vast amounts of time that we're talking about. When we consider the history of philosophy, we must always consider the fact that we are dropping back 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 centuries. So on our part, it will require an imaginative leap. We are going to have to think our way back to the position of early philosophers, of early thinkers, of early cultures that don't have the advantage of the historical experience that we do, that don't have the advantage of the sophisticated technological advances that we do, that don't have any of the presuppositions that we bring to questions of right and wrong, to questions of justice and injustice, to questions of truth and falsehood. The ancient world that philosophy originated from was a world full of myths, a world full of imaginative stories, which took the place of rational explanations of things. So when we treat the history of philosophy, we have to come to it with an open mind and a willingness to think ourselves back out of the level of sophistication that we happen to be in today, back to the level of the problems and the level of the perplexity of the ancients. If you're willing to make that sort of intellectual leap and perform that kind of intellectual sympathy or empathy with earlier thinkers, your chances of absorbing and appreciating these philosophical debates increases dramatically. Now, I spoke earlier about ontology, about the question of what is. And that topic is going to be very important in our analysis and our breaking down, our consideration of the entire history of Western philosophy. There are basically only two answers to the question, what is? It's such a simple question that you can see how it wouldn't provide a great many alternatives at the most fundamental level. There are two basic answers to the question of what is in the Western tradition. The first answer to the question is that what is nature. That is, there's simply tables and chairs and objects of sense perception. That there are no gods or spirits or demons or anything mystical, anything non-physical, anything non-sensible. In other words, there's a whole school of philosophy, dates all the way back to the ancient Greek pre-Socratic physicists, which treats the world as simply made up of atoms and the void, or matter and space. There is no room for a second world. There's no room for God or angels or spirits or anything that's independent of human sense perceptions. So for those philosophers who believe that the world is basically natural, who approach nature as being ontologically fundamental, these people will be the origins of materialistic interpretations of the world. Those people who take nature to be fundamental and exclusively the only thing that exists are going to end up being the kind of ancestors of the philosophical materialists. Now, there's a second group of philosophers and a second answer to the question of what is. In the Western intellectual tradition, an alternative to insisting that only nature exists is the possibility of saying that nature plus something else exists, some second world, some world outside of our immediate sense perceptions, some world that's external to space and time. And in the Western intellectual tradition, this world is usually called heaven or hell or some transcendent realm where divine things are kept outside this profane world of space and time that we encounter on an everyday level. For all believing Christians and Jews, the answer to what exists has to be the world around us, which is nature, but also God and the saints or the souls of those who have gone on before us, and also things like angels. In other words, for those who are religious believers, for example, there is a second world independent of the world of space and time that has an ontologically distinct set of things within it, things like God, the angels, moral virtue perhaps for some philosophers. There will be abstractions. There will be things independent of our senses. It's like that line in Hamlet where Hamlet says, there are more things on heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy, Horatio. Well, it may well be that those naturalistic philosophers are mistaken, and perhaps there is a second world where things that are not objects of sense perception, which do not exist within the realm of space and time, are kept and connect somehow to our world. In addition to the tradition of religious belief in Western thought, there's also a Greek tradition of metaphysics, a Greek otherworldly tradition, which says that the world is broken into two pieces. There's a world of nature, a world of immediate sense perception, the world of space and time, and a second world, the world of the forms. In many respects, this second world is like the Christian or Jewish heaven. It's an extra world where something divine, something of superlative importance, rains down its significance and its will on this world of space and time that human beings happen to live in. In the case of Plato, and the Greek metaphysical tradition, this second world is called the realm of the forms, and the realm of the forms is a place of pure ideas, of pure thought, that's somehow more real, more permanent, more everlasting than this world of becoming, this world of change, this world of flux that we inhabit. So there are basically two answers in the Western intellectual tradition to the question of what exists. Answer number one to the question is nature. Nature exists, the world of space and time. The pre-Socratic physicists were the first and most important examples of people who held the view that the only real thing is the world of space and time, the world of nature. In addition, modern science, particularly the modern science that develops in the Renaissance and then in the Enlightenment, is very much beholden to this tradition of secular knowledge that comes to the West from the pre-Socratic physicists. So this naturalistic approach to knowledge and this naturalistic approach to what is leads to some of the most fruitful and important elements in the Western intellectual tradition, and it's about half of the significant thinkers, I would say, in the entire tradition have made that ontological assumption. The other half of the centrally important thinkers in the Western tradition adopted the two worlds position, adopted what we would call a metaphysical set of assumptions about ontology. For people that hold this view, there is a world of space and time, there's a world of sense perceptions, but there's also some other world. And this view is something that both Platonists and Christians can agree upon. There's some world external to our sense perceptions, external to the world of change and flux around us, which is permanent, which is of supreme importance, and which it is the obligation of every human being to somehow connect themselves to insofar as they're capable. This second world, for those philosophers who believe in such a thing, this second world is of enormous significance. It contains all our potential for virtue. It contains some eternal moral standards by which to judge the good and evil of human actions. And it somehow justifies and punishes good and evil actions down here. This will be true for Plato. This will be true for the God of Christianity and Judaism. This will be true for all constructs which allow for the existence of that second world, of that metaphysical realm. These two ontological positions, the one-world view and the two-world view, the view that everything is physics and everything is space and time, and the view that things are space and time plus something else, that the world is nature plus something else. This is the ontological bedrock of the Western intellectual tradition. All of the remaining intellectuals that you're going to hear about throughout this entire series of lectures will have something to say about this ontological question. And once they commit themselves one way or another to this ontological position of one world or the alternative ontological position of two worlds, all sorts of implications are carried on and entailed in that. A certain view of ethics will come from each position. A certain view of politics will come out of each position. A certain view of aesthetics, of the philosophy of mind, of epistemology. All sorts of profound intellectual decisions will be made on the basis of what school of philosophy we find ourselves connected to. So you have to be careful throughout the history of philosophy to get a sense early on of what sort of philosopher you're dealing with. Once you know whether he's a one-world philosopher or a two-world philosopher, much of what follows in his philosophy will make a great deal more sense, because all of philosophy forms one coherent whole, at least among the best thinkers. Now, in addition to the questions of ontology, there's the question of historical development in the Western tradition. And if we look at the Western tradition as a kind of vast panorama of ideas and thinkers and formulations of old and sometimes new contributions to thought, two places and two traditions stand out as being central and fundamental to the Western intellectual endeavor. And I'd say this is the tradition that comes out of Athens and the tradition that comes out of Jerusalem. The tradition that comes from liberated rationality and human freedom, and the tradition that comes from reverence and piety and faith in God. These are the two parts of a braid that the intellectual life of the West forms when you step back and look at it over the centuries. If any of you know what the caduceus is, the caduceus is the symbol of pharmacy, of the apothecary, of the doctor's art. And what it is a stake with two snakes twined around it, forming a sort of a braid. Well, the traditions of Athens and Jerusalem form that kind of a braid in Western culture. The mythos of Western culture, the fundamental myths, the fundamental orientation towards right and wrong, the fundamental conception of metaphysics that is characteristic of the Western tradition comes out of Jerusalem. It comes out of the stories of the Old and the New Testament. The rational element in the Western tradition, the tradition of humanism, of free, unfettered rationality, the human-centered element in Western intellectual culture comes out of Greece, and to be specific, it comes out of one city, it comes out of Athens. Athens is the home of Socrates, and Socrates can be thought of as the sort of patron saint of free and rational inquiry. Athens is the contributor in the Western culture of the idea that nothing human is foreign to us, that what is potentially true for one human being is accessible to all, that there is one common logos, one common rationality, which unites all of human beings and which will allow them to dispel the darkness of myth and irrationality, which the Greeks think hangs over us like a fog. The Greek tradition is the tradition of free discourse. The Greek tradition is the tradition of rationality without any necessary reference to mythological thinking. And the Greek tradition is organized around the idea of human beings as opposed to gods. There is, of course, a Greek pantheon, and there's no shortage of Greek myths. No one that's aware of Greek tragedy would ever hold that sort of a view. But what is remarkable and unique about Greek culture, as opposed to the other cultures that were contemporaneous with it, is that in Greek culture there is a drive towards secular knowledge. And this is a thorough turnaround from the earlier tradition of thought, which has been entirely organized around myths. Secular knowledge is a new and important idea that comes to us from the secular Greek thinkers, particularly in this case, the Greek pre-Socratic physicists and the Greek sophists. Now, two terms are very important when we look at the history of Western philosophy, both as it comes out of Athens and as it comes out of Jerusalem. The first word is logos, and the second word is mythos. Logos in Greek means speech, word, reason, talk. It means rational discourse, essentially. Now, in Greek philosophy, rational discourse has a preeminent place. The Socratic dialogues are works of art which raise philosophical, rational discourse to the realm of archetypes of thinking, archetypes of approaching knowledge in a particularly rational, humane, man-centered way. The Greek view of logos is free, unfettered rationality. Now, there's an alternative conception of logos which is no less valid. And this is the conception of logos that we find in particularly the New Testament. The New Testament is written in Greek, and that is a fact of enormous consequences for the history of Western thought. The Old Testament is written in Hebrew, the Quran is written in Arabic. Alone of the sacred books in the tradition that comes out of Jerusalem, the New Testament, written in Greek, has the most definite affinities to Greek culture, and the constant attempt to unify Athens and Jerusalem to create a rapprochement between Greek culture and the culture of biblical faith, in large part stems from the fact that Christian intellectuals, by virtue of being able to read Scripture in the original, also have access to the Greek intellectual tradition, which is something that comes packaged with the Greek language that we don't see in the tradition of rabbinic Judaism, and we don't see in the tradition of exegesis that comes out of the Quran. It has to do with the language that these scriptures are written in. Now, in the tradition of biblical faith, logos does not mean free, untrammeled reason. It has that connotation because it's taken from the Greek. But in fact, logos means word. The Gospel of John, the first passage, the first verse in the first chapter says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh." The word for word here is logos. And what we mean by "in the beginning was the Word" is that the beginning, the primary Ur-stuff of the world, the fundamental reality, is the Word of God. Nothing comes prior to that. Nothing is more fundamental. Nothing is more basic. The authoritative, fundamental, divine Word of God is the logos in the sense in which logos is used in the Greek tradition. The fact that both those who are devotees of Athens and those who are devotees of Jerusalem have both been using the same word for one of their favorite things has been the source of an endless amount of confusion and difficulties in the history of Western philosophy. So, just to take some of these confusions out early on, there are two ways of thinking about the logos, and perhaps they're not entirely separate. Perhaps there is a divine element, a universal element to free, unfettered human discourse. And perhaps there is some element of the mythical or of the divine or of the more than human in either God's revelation or even in the thought that God might reveal his will to us. In either case, devotees of Athens and Jerusalem have been gerrymandering and playing with the Greek language, with a poor dead language, for many generations now, and it's just as well that you get used to it early on. If you do, it will perhaps remove some of the perplexities that may emerge in the course of our discussions. We have quite a ways to go in our history of Western philosophy. Now, there's a second important word in our consideration of Athens and Jerusalem, and that word is mythos. And mythos just means story, or at least, if I want to be a little oversimple about it, it just means story. It's the word from which we derive our term myth. And it's a story, but it's more than a story. It's somehow an archetypical story. It's a story about, we assume, fictional people doing fictional things, yet it's a lie that tells the truth, because this story has a universal applicability independent of the person that is alleged to have done these things. We will find examples of such universally applicable myths if we look at something like, the myth of Oedipus, right, in Greek tragedy, or the Oresteia in Greek tragedy, or for that matter, the Iliad and the Odyssey in Homer. These myths are not just rousing adventure stories. They mean to tell us some moral truth about the human condition, or some truth about the human condition regarding the fact that there is no morality. But either way, you are being told something fundamental about the human condition in these myths, which is not to be despised and not to be disdained simply because it doesn't appear in the form of mathematical equations. It still has something to say, but it says it in an indirect and perhaps ambiguous way. Now, both the Athenian tradition and the tradition that comes out of Jerusalem have their characteristic myths. They have an archetypical myth which describes what it means to be the perfect Athenian, what it means to be the perfect man of Jerusalem. Another way of stating it is that it has a set of myths which describe heroes, heroes with perhaps different conceptions of heroism, but heroes who exemplify some virtue which is taken to be fundamental and enormously significant in each of these two intellectual traditions. Let's think about these two exemplary myths and see if we can't fish out some qualities of the tradition of Athens and the tradition of Jerusalem while we think about these. Let's start with the tradition of Jerusalem. Now, there are lots of possible choices because the books of the Bible are so rich and profound that you would be hard-pressed to cover any of the important books of the Bible and not find some figure there whose moral status is such that this myth has something to say to us today. But in going through the Bible, I'm going to go straight to one of my real favorites. And he has a book all to himself. This is the story of Job. And Job is God's faithful servant. Job, in some respects, represents the high point of religious faith. Job is the perfect example of the true religious believer, the man who understands his relationship to God, who understands his relationship to things of this world, and who shows only the deepest and most profound virtue in the biblical sense in his relationship to God. For those of you who haven't read the Bible, either lately or ever, let me briefly tell you what the story of Job is. Job is God's faithful servant. He's a real good guy. He constantly does all the things that God requires of him. God has given him a good bit of favor, given him a wife, children, given him wealth, given him land, given him flocks, made him a happy man, a man of this world, a man of many pleasures and many diversions. Constantly, Job performs the appropriate sacrifices. Job praises God. Job shows the appropriate humility and obedience in the face of God's awesome majesty. Job is thankful, and Job praises God, and God is well pleased with Job. Now, at some point, it's not exactly said when, and in some place, it's not exactly said where, the devil starts talking to God. And the devil says to God, the only reason Job really likes you, and the only reason he sacrifices to you and praises you, is because you've done all these good things for him. If you hadn't sent him a lovely wife and a lovely family and flocks and wealth and land and all the things that a man can have in this world, he would never be faithful to you. This faith is really a sham. It's really a way of him getting more favors from you. Now, it becomes kind of strange here. Apparently, God and Satan make a bet. Now, it never gets explained why anyone would want to make a bet with God, since he knows everything already, nor is it clear why anyone would make a bet with Satan or how Satan got into it. But bracket that for a while. I think they're trying to tell you a different story here. The key issue in Job is this, that God gratuitously sends down to Job a terrible series of catastrophes. His family gets stricken with diseases and with invasion, and they're killed, and his possessions are scattered, and his house is burnt down, and he loses all the lovely things he has. And he's afflicted with boils and pains and diseases and all the evils of the human flesh. And all through this, Job is completely faithful and constantly praises God, saying, I know my status, God. Whatever you send is right. God is God. Man is man. I will never transgress the boundary and blame God, because that's the ultimate blasphemy, that man should judge God. The point here being that whatever God sends a human being, doubtless, if there is a God, a providence running the world, there's a reason for it, and we ought not to dispute with the deity, telling him how to run the universe, because we are as earthworms to God. We do not have the same level of consciousness, and for us to inform God that we don't think he's running the world properly is the height of impertinence and would be the last and most vicious of actions within the framework of religious faith. Job is the man who holds back, who constantly has faith in God and constantly praises God despite the ills that beset him. which he knows somehow come from God, but which he does not blame God for. Job's friends tell him, you ought to blaspheme, Job. We don't have the same faith that you do. Job's wife tells him, look, Job, curse God and die. That's all that's left for you. Job says to his wife, he says to his friends, you don't understand the nature of real religious faith. I'm Job, that's God. I'm going to be God's faithful servant. So what he ultimately decides to do is to just sit there and take it and constantly praise God. Well, at the end of the story, oddly enough, this has a happy ending, God is very well pleased with Job. Why? Because Job, as a human being, has shown the greatest of human virtues, which is religious faith. Under the burden of all disenchantment, under the burden of all anxiety, under the burden of all misery, the point of Job's patience, the point of Job's faith, is to teach us that the perfect virtue of the person who adheres to biblical religion is faith in God under all circumstances. Job is God's faithful servant, and that's the mythos, that's the central virtue and the central good person in biblical religion, or one of the central good people. Now let's take an alternative to that. The man who shakes his fist at God, the man who wants to be like God, the man full of Greek hubris. Let's take the perfect Greek man, and there are again a lot of choices here. We could choose Achilles from Homer, great heroic figure. We could choose Odysseus because he was smart as well as being tough. That's another alternative. But my choice for the perfect Greek man is Prometheus. Prometheus, the man who's not quite at the level of the gods, but would like to be. And although he knows that he's somehow subordinate to the gods, he's still the man who wants to move himself up. Instead of having the humility and the faith that was characteristic of Job, Prometheus is the man who shakes his fist at the gods, the man who disobeys the gods knowing he's going to be punished and doesn't care. He's the man who wants to be something more than human. Prometheus is a titan who felt sorry for the human beings when they were being created because they weren't given the advantages of the animals. They didn't have claws and teeth. They didn't have the swiftness of deer. They didn't have the coloration of chameleons. They didn't have anything going for them. Prometheus liked human beings, and despite the fact that Zeus says that you can't bring the fire of the gods, you can't bring this divine spark down to human beings, Prometheus deceives Zeus. Prometheus goes against what the greatest of the Greek gods tells him to do. Prometheus says, I'm going to do what I will. It's pure satanic will. Those of you who have read Paradise Lost and who understand what it means to say that I would rather rule in hell than serve in heaven, understand what the Promethean element is. Prometheus is an important Greek myth because it says what the Greeks really are. If you think of the Greek pantheon as not being an enormous and omnipotent creator god, but in fact being personifications of the forces of nature, when Prometheus shakes his fist at the gods and says to the greatest of the gods, I will master you, I will defy you, I will see the day that you die, what the Greeks are saying is that the day will come when the drive to make human beings divine, that the day will come when the drive to make human beings more than they are will succeed. We will conquer not just the pantheon of the mythological gods, we will conquer the forces of nature, we will conquer blind chance, and we will somehow be more than men. This is the heroic temptation. In Greek tragedy, this is called hubris. This is that pride. This is that overweening desire to be something more than you ought to be, to break out of the bonds of nature and to become something more. This megalomaniacal pride, this desire to be something more than merely human, is the essence, is the core of the Greek approach to the world. It defies God, it defies nature, all in the name of increasing and enlarging and improving the world of human will and the world of human action. The world of Job is an entirely God-centered world. Men are but insects within such a world. They don't count for very much. Within the Greek approach to things, the gods are fictions, or if they're not fictions, they're at least the kind of nature forces that we can somehow get around, that we can somehow supplant and make ourselves superior to them if we but have sufficient daring and sufficient will. All of Greek heroism, all of Greek epic, all of Greek tragedy is derived from this essentially satanic pride. And here I don't mean satanic in the sense of being evil or devilish. I mean satanic like Milton's Satan, a man who, or a creature who would be more than human, but somehow can't quite be at the level of real godhood, These are titans. These are men who want to be something more than human. The whole Greek project of creating secular knowledge, of mastering nature, of reaching the fundamental axioms of mathematics, of enlarging the realm of free, untrammeled rationality, all of these ideas are caught up in the image of Prometheus. So when we braid together the tradition of Athens and Jerusalem, we are really asking ourselves, do we want the virtues of Athens, or do we want the virtues of Jerusalem? Do we want to be like Job, or do we want to be like Prometheus? And there's a problem here. This is something worth your consideration as you let the remainder of the lectures wash over you, as you think through what you're being told. That the human psyche, or the human soul, is made up of a heterogeneous set of components. We have a rational element to us that allows us to do our taxes and allows us to do geometry. We have an emotional element in us which allows us to appreciate poetry and allows us to fall in love. We have the desire for religious illumination. Testimony to that is the fact that we have constructed the religious systems, the religious art and architecture that we have. We have many heterogeneous desires and many heterogeneous elements built into our psyche, or our soul, or our mind. And insofar as we exclusively focus on just Job, or just Prometheus, insofar as we wish to be just Athenian, or just derived from Jerusalem, we have locked ourselves into an either-or alternative that I suspect is not entirely satisfactory. Different sorts of philosopher, different sorts of philosophical discourse, different sorts of thinking offer us different sorts of pleasure and different sorts of improvement. In other words, do not make the mistake of thinking that all edifying philosophies start from the same assumptions and come to the same conclusions. I think that that is a fundamental error. In fact, there are alternative sets of assumptions and alternative sets of conclusions which may well be contradictory between themselves, and yet listening to them, thinking about them, and letting them do something to you, by actually engaging with them, you may be edified in different kinds of ways. It may improve different elements in your soul. In other words, different kinds of thinking are good for you. The great philosopher Wittgenstein once said that philosophical illnesses usually stem from a dietary deficiency. They stem from a situation in which our intellectual diet is deficient in examples. If we constantly think about religion and religious texts and religious issues, we may well have a dietary deficiency that is lacking in scientific or mathematical examples. Similarly, if we were to be extremely positivistic, organize our thinking only around physics and mathematics and formal logic, it may well be that questions of good and evil, questions of human history, human destiny, what's good for both individuals and societies, it may well be that questions like that will escape us if we were exclusively scientific in our orientation. So what I would plead for here is, first of all, an open mind, a willingness not just to be edified when you hear a philosopher telling you what you already believe. What I'm asking you is to have the courage not just to hold the convictions that you do, but the courage to attack your convictions, to call your convictions into question, to ask yourself, suppose I'm completely wrong. Suppose the other set of assumptions or the other set of conclusions is the real one. How would I know? Am I really certain about what I think I know? If you do that seriously, if you sincerely apply yourself to the tradition of Athens and to the tradition of Jerusalem, I think you will maximize what a course of lectures in the history of Western philosophy can potentially offer you. If you don't at least make the attempt to extend the set of your assumptions and to extend the reach of your conclusions, to include not just what you believe now, but the alternative set of beliefs, or the set of beliefs that you've had some doubts about in the past. At least think through the possibility of what it would be like to believe that. Ask yourself what the pluses and minuses are. And if you want a kind of formula for intellectual honesty when you confront these and other questions that we'll have to deal with in the next 63 lectures, you might want to constantly ask yourself the following question. Do I believe this issue, let's call the issue XYZ? And then secondarily, what would count as evidence either for this proposition or against it? If you are willing to look for evidence in favor of what you believe and also evidence in favor of what you do not believe or in favor of what you reject, the intellectual honesty that you will bring to these issues will benefit you both in your understanding and in your capacity to absorb these works, because understanding is just the first stage. After you understand, you have to absorb, and after absorbing the message of both Athens and Jerusalem, then the question is action, and that's outside the realm of these lectures. What we're going to move to next, in the next set of lectures we do, will be the pre-Socratic philosophers. What is important about the pre-Socratic philosophers is that they are the earliest example of the Greek drive to create secular knowledge. We are indebted to these Greek physicists for the foundations of the sort of science that was developed in the Renaissance and later, and for the secular, skeptical, rational element in Greek culture, which continues on in the Western tradition right through to today. Thank you.
It is a great delight for me to be here this morning, and I say that partly because I think that what Tom Rollins has done in founding the teaching company is a testimony in equal parts to his genius and to his boldness. I say that in part because you have had the genius and the wisdom to show up to attempt to learn something about the Old Testament of the Hebrew Bible, and I say that partly because it's so much fun for me to talk about it. If you ask me, what in life do you most enjoy? I would talk about fishing for trout and salmon, and I chase trout and salmon with my fly rod from Iceland to Alaska with lots of stops in between. I would join, I suspect, all of you who are parents and say, well, if you get right down to it, there's not much in life I enjoy more than talking about my kids, and I'm glad you asked. But I would also include in any such series of comments about what I most enjoy reading the Old Testament, thinking about what the Old Testament is all about, and attempting to make sense of it for others, and that opportunity you have given to me. As intriguing as is the world of the Old Testament, and an introduction to that world we're beginning right now this morning, it is also a powerfully complex world, and because it is a powerfully complex world, what I'm going to do in the first lecture, and I know all of you in this audience and others who will have access to this material have an outline for this, as for other lectures. What I'm going to do this initial lecture is to, in part, give you an outline of where we have been and where we are going. And one of the reasons we need to do that, and one of the reasons I want to make sure I do this initially, is the following. We're going to follow a procedure in going through the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, which at first is going to seem powerfully curious, but which I suspect after a lecture or two will feel increasingly comfortable and I hope increasingly commonsensical. Because what we're going to do is this. We're not going to look at the books of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament in the order in which you find them as you open your Old Testaments. We are instead going to look at the books of the Old Testament in the order in which they fall historically. That is to say, if I were to pick up my Hebrew Bible, and it is an authentic Hebrew Bible up here, which I will be using throughout this course, I would begin with the book that's called in Hebrew Bereshit, the book that's called in English Genesis, and then I'd get to Shemot, the book that's called in English Exodus, and then I'd get to Vayikra, the book that's called Leviticus, and I would conclude with Divrei Hayomim, Aleph, and Beit, and those are the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. If you've got another English Bible, an English Bible based upon Christianity's canon, which is based on a Greek Bible, your Bibles will begin with Genesis, but they will end with the book of Malachi rather than with 1st and 2nd Chronicles. That's one way to do the Old Testament. Start at the beginning as you read it. Now, basically, the beginning for this book means the right-hand side because Hebrew is written correctly from right to left rather than perversely from left to right, as is English. One way to introduce oneself to the Old Testament of the Hebrew Bible is that way. We're not going to do that. Instead, we're going to go through the history of the religion of Israel, and at each point in that history, when we come upon a document in the Old Testament of the Hebrew Bible, we will talk about it. I think it is far and away the best and the clearest way to talk about the Old Testament, but it will initially seem a little bit complicated, and hence the reason why I'm going through everything the way I am in this first talk. I have 3 tasks that I wish to accomplish, and I know I can accomplish 2 of them, and I think I'll get fairly through the third of them, and perhaps entirely through it this morning. They are first to talk about the course of the course. That's Roman numeral 2 on your outline. What's this course going to look like? Secondly, I'm going to ask a blatantly commonsensical question, and I hope give to it a less than commonsensical and intriguing answer. And that question is, what is the Old Testament? And then finally, I'm going to conclude with something that, in fact, you will find reappears throughout the following 7 lecture, and that is an outline history of ancient Israel. So let's begin at the beginning with an outline history of the course, and I'm going to precede that outline of the course by a few comments on the ancient Near East. As one counts powerful empires, as one counts nation-states which were important in economic, especially in political terms at the times, ancient Israel is not a major power. Ancient Israel never acquired anything like the status of an ancient superpower. Now, in terms of influence upon Western civilization and upon the rest of history, of course, Israel's power is immeasurable. But compared with other nations in that part of the world, it was a small and a fairly backward one. The superpowers of the ancient Near East were above all Egypt and the 2 nation-states in ancient Mesopotamia, Babylonia, and Assyria. And you will find me fairly often in this lecture and in the 7 that follows, talking about ancient Egypt, talking about Assyria, the northern nation-state in what we think of as present-day Iraq or ancient Mesopotamia, and Babylon or Babylonia, the southern nation-state in what we think of as ancient Mesopotamia or modern Iraq. Now, I'm going to do that. I'm going to talk as often as I will about extra-Israelite, about other ancient Near Eastern religions and politics and economics, not because I'm a priest in the cult of some Phoenician religion. I'm not. I say that partly because after about halfway through one Old Testament course during those wonderful 14-plus years that I taught at Dartmouth, a wonderfully bright and questioning Dartmouth student came up to me and said, "Excuse me, sir, but with what Syrian religion are you affiliated?" And she asked that because the presumption was that if I was talking about ancient Syria as much as I was, I must have been accepted into the cult of some long-dead Syrian religion and be practicing that still. That's not true at all. I'm doing it rather for the following reason, that the last 150, and especially the last 100, and most especially the last 20 years of archaeology in the ancient Near East have made superabundantly clear what we suspected long before that, and that is the following, that great chunks, great aspects of the religion and the religious literature of ancient Israel were imported, were borrowed, came from, ultimately, the religions and the literatures of Israel's ancient neighbors. Now, to say that is initially to say something pretty shocking, and it's to say it for the following reason. Do I mean to say that those very religions against which the Old Testament so combatively speaks, the religion of Jezebel, the religion of the Phoenicians or the Canaanites, the religion of the Pharaoh who wouldn't let the Israelites go in Egypt, the religion of Nebuchadnezzar or Tiglath-Pileser III, or Nabonidus, the religion of Assyria, do I mean to say that those very religions against which the Old Testament so systematically rails were the religions from which ancient Israel drew an awful lot of the material that made up the religion of Israel? I do. I do mean to say precisely that. We suspected that for a long time. The archaeological results of the last century plus have demonstrated that. And let me give you one example. It may seem trivial, but in fact it's not. Rather than just talking in vague terms about how much we have learned of late about the ancient Near East and how much that has helped us learn more about the religion of Israel, even how to read sentences, how to translate particular verses. Let me talk about a poetic technique briefly, a poetic technique about which we have only known for about 50 years. It's a poetic technique that shows up crystal clearly in the poetry of the ancient Canaanites. Now, you will learn as I go through here that Canaanites and Phoenicians are synonyms. And the Canaanites are the people who lived in the land of Israel, including many Israelites, before there was an Israel. After the state of Israel was established, and I'll go through all of this in greater detail, the Canaanites were limited to a chunk on the coast of the Mediterranean, just opposite Crete, in fact, and became known at that point as the Phoenicians. They became known as the Phoenicians because the Greeks began to know about them, and Phoenician is a Greek term, as Canaanite is a native Canaanite term. Confusing for now, but the point is, people living in what was going to be Israel, and then living as a neighbor of Israel, the ancient Phoenicians or Canaanites, had a poetic technique which is easily describable and which goes as follows. It's the technique of two lines of poetry which are nearly synonymous. So if the ancient Canaanites were talking about an event, they would talk about it in one series of nouns and verbs, and then nearly repeat that in the second line. Slightly different synonyms, slightly enrich the first line, but making the same sense statement. Now, this afternoon, as it happens, and none of you may be at home or wherever it's being played in time to watch on television, this afternoon, as it happens, because Georgetown defeated South Florida on Thursday night in basketball, and because Florida State defeated the University of Montana in basketball on Thursday, this afternoon at something like 4 or 5 o'clock, the Georgetown basketball team is going to play the Florida State basketball team. And if an ancient Phoenician or Canaanite were talking about that basketball game, and, presuming, not accidentally, because I'm speaking on the Georgetown campus, that Georgetown wins the game this afternoon, that ancient Canaanite or Phoenician would say the following: Georgetown obliterated Florida State, the Hoyas smashed the Seminoles. Something like Georgetown obliterated Florida State, the Hoyas smashed the Seminoles. And you and I would know what they're talking about, because we know what Florida State means and we know what Georgetown means. We know that the Hoyas is the name for the athletic teams that play from this university, and we know that the Seminoles is the name of the Florida State football team, and we know, in this case, basketball team, and we know what the words obliterated and smashed means. But imagine you're reading a verse in the Hebrew Bible and you know what almost none of those words mean. And that is very often the case, especially of Hebrew Bible or Old Testament poetry. An awful lot of that is material where for a great many years we have guessed at the meanings of words. If you didn't know this poetic technique, you might presume that 4 different athletic teams were being talked about, and you might presume that in one case it was a victory, and in another case it was a defeat. But now that we know this poetic technique, great chunks of the poetry in the Old Testament that formerly did not make sense to us make sense. I'll give you one even more concrete example, an example that comes from a prophet at whom, in fact, we will not look at great length, from Zechariah 9:9. In the 9th chapter of the book of Zechariah, there is a discussion of what it will look like when a messianic king enters the city. Now, we will see, as when we talk about the rise of kingship in this course, that kings were anointed, that the Hebrew word for anoint is mashach, that from that word anoint comes the notion of Messiah, and that there grew up in later Old Testament apocalyptic prophecy the notion that at some day a Messiah would come into existence, would enter the city of Jerusalem gloriously, and would restore the fallen fortunes of Jerusalem. And this is how Zechariah 9:9 in part, if I can find 9:9, describes what the entrance of the Messianic king into the city of Jerusalem will be like. Shout greatly for joy, O daughter of Zion. Make a happy sound, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. Victorious and delivered is he. This is the important 2 verses now. He is humble and riding on an ass. He's upon a colt, the foal of an ass. As he enters the city, the king is humble and riding on an ass, upon the colt, the foal of an ass. Now, how many animals is this king riding on? One. It's a portrait, a symbolic, impressionistic portrait of what it will be like. And it is saying, when the Messiah comes, he will enter the city on a beast of burden. And let me give you some examples of the kind of beast of burden on which he might enter. But we're not talking about a circus rider here, with one foot on one saddle and one foot on another. And we're not talking about somebody jumping from animal to animal or anything equally ludicrous. It's a king entering the city on a beast of burden. Now, was this ever misunderstood? You bet your boots. I can show you portraits in most of the great museums of Europe of this verse as applied by Christian artists to Jesus, and usually Jesus is riding several animals. Or there's one animal with a couple of others trotting alongside. And you will notice those. And please do the next time you look at some Christian portraiture of Jesus entering the city of Jerusalem, and there are usually several animals. Now, that's a misunderstanding of a poetic technique that the ancient Near East has now taught us to understand more clearly. What's the course going to look like? Okay? That is a comment or two on why the ancient Near East is as important to us as it is. This course it has an outline which I think you'll find is fairly straightforward, because it is the history of the religion of Israel in chronological order. Now, because we're going to go through that in chronological order, I'm going to be a little bit brief right here, but I've put on this outline the title of the outlines of the ensuing 7 lectures. Numbers 2 through 8 are the religion of Israel in chronological order. I didn't put 1 on there, except I put it in parentheses, so you could see I'd not forgotten that I was speaking lecture 1 right now, but it is lectures 2 through 8 that correspond with the history of the religion of Israel in chronological order, and that means we're going to start with the religion of the Tribal League. We start with the religion of the Tribal League, or the Tribal Confederacy, or the 12 Tribes of Israel, whatever term you're most familiar with in thinking of this, because this is the first time that there was a collection of people with enough sense of self-identity, with enough cohesiveness that we can call them Israel. Even though we can, in a sense, call them Israel, during the period of the Tribal League, it will have been tribal loyalties which still dominated. So if you asked your average man in the street, or more likely your average man or woman in a donkey track north of the city of Jerusalem, what are you? You wanted some statement of collective identity in answer to your question. She or he would have said, I'm a Benjaminite, or I'm a Danite, or I'm a Manassite, or I'm a something like that. They would have answered in terms of a tribal identity rather than saying they're an Israelite. The Tribal League gives way to the monarchy, gives way to a period when there were kings in Israel, and that means in the second lecture following this initial one, we're going to talk about the religion of the monarchy. And that already gives you a clue to what I'm doing in a very significant sense. If we're talking first about a religion that accompanied the social and political structure that we call the Tribal League, and then we're going to talk about a religion that accompanied a social and a political structure that we call the monarchy, Israel with a king, does that mean to suggest that a people's religion bears a strong relationship to its social structure? And the answer to that question is yes. It is probably predictable by all of you had I asked you to predict that, but I'll assert it once again. There is a fair amount, not a complete one-for-one, but there is a fair amount of isomorphism or correspondence between a people's social structure and its religion. And that means when the social and political structure of ancient Israel switches from a tribally based one to a nation-state with a king, we're going to see some fairly dramatic switches in the way that religion is structured. And that's what happens between the Tribal League and the monarchy. The fourth lecture I'll give, and the third in our course of going through the history of religion in chronological order, is about something I'm going to call Israel's epic. Not my term, but not a usual term. Now, as you have grown up, those of you who've grown up with the Bible, and as you've read either the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, and those are synonymous terms, by the way. The Hebrew Bible is one of the terms that Judaism gives to this collection. They also frequently call it the Tanakh, after Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, 3 of the chief divisions in Hebrew, the Hebrew of the Bible. Christians tend to call this collection of material the Old Testament. I will switch back and forth at will. But whether I'm talking about the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, I'm talking about the same set of documents. As you've looked through the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, and you're looking at the top of the page, you've noticed Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel. You didn't notice the term epic. What book in the Hebrew Bible am I talking about? Well, I'm not. I'm talking about the story behind the first 4 or 5 books in the Hebrew Bible, a story that I'll describe at length. But that story, the story from creation through the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, through Moses, through Israel in Egypt, and then Israel getting out of Egypt into the land of Canaan, the land that would be Israel, that story functioned in ancient Israel, as did, for example, the Iliad in ancient Greece, or as did the Aeneid in Augustan Rome. And since we call the Iliad and the Aeneid the epics of pre-Periclean Athens and of Augustan Rome, I think it's very useful for us to think of that basic story as ancient Israel's epic, and we'll talk about that. I am devoting one entire lecture to one book of the Hebrew Bible, and it's the only time I'll do that, and I do it not accidentally. The 5th lecture in our course, and therefore the first one tomorrow morning, is going to be on the book of Exodus, and I'm going to make the slightly hyperbolic, but for all that I think sustainable claim that the book of Exodus is the heart of the Old Testament. That if one were forced to pick one book which was most formative, most shaping, most descriptive of ancient Judaism, that was most central to the religion of ancient Israel, and thank heavens we don't have to pick a single book, but if we had to do that, we would pick the book of Exodus. After I talk about the book of Exodus in chronological order, and we're getting to about the 8th to the 7th century, as you will see, I'm going to talk about the place of prophets in the religion of Israel, and we will find there, as I think you will find throughout this course, a big surprise and a lot of surprises. If I could bring into this room Elijah, Elisha, Amos, Hosea, Jeremiah, Isaiah, Zephaniah, Nahum, Malachi, and a bunch of others, and I had set these folks in the middle in the aisle right here, and I said, you know, you folks are called Nevi'im, or Navi, the ancient Hebrew term for prophet, and I'm going to ask the people in this room what they think prophet means, and some of you may even have brought along a dictionary, and the people in this room standing in front of Jeremiah and Ezekiel and all these other characters say, well, a prophet means someone who can foretell future events. There is almost nothing that would more befuddle and baffle this group of ancient Israelite prophets than your definition. If you said to them, I believe that a prophet is one who foretells future events, you'd get head shaking and anger. Whatever the ancient Israelite prophets did, and we'll go through at great length precisely what they did, they would not have thought of that as anything like one of their chief functions. Well, what were their chief functions? Well, they were the reminders of ethical conduct. But above all, they were those who prosecuted Israel for breaking their agreement, for breaking their covenant between the God of Israel and them. I brought this group in and said, I think berit, I think the Hebrew term berith, the word covenant, or the notion of a treaty, is where you folks belong. And I think you're here because to remind us that we've not kept our side of the treaty, and therefore to blast us, to condemn us for not keeping our side of the treaty, their head shaking and their head scratching would have turned to assent. Yes, that's what we're all about. After I talk about the prophets, I'm going to talk about the single most important, if equally most devastating event in the history of ancient Israel, and hence the single most productive event with regard to Old Testament literature, and that is something called the exile. Now, about the exile, I'll already talk before we're finished this morning, and then I'll talk at greater length, obviously, when we get there. But for now, and probably self-evidently, it means that there was a military defeat at one point on the behalf of one of those superpowers, and a part of that military defeat was that some Israelites were taken out of the land, were exiled. And the response to the exile, the response on the behalf of ancient Israelites to having been militarily defeated and then removed out of the land, produces the equivalent of Elizabethan England or the Italy of Dante. It's the most fruitful and productive literary period in Israelite religion. What does this thing mean? Does it mean that the religion of Israel is over? Does it mean that the God of Israel no longer cares about us? Does it mean that the God of Israel is not a God at all? Does it mean that the God of Israel is a God, but that there are other gods like the gods of that country that just defeated us, who are more powerful? Does it? And I could go on and on. Those kinds of questions were prompted by this event, and therefore we're going to look both at the questions and some of the answers. And then finally, and all of this, of course, we will do lecture by lecture, we're going to look at the reconstruction of the Israelite religion after the exile. And I'm going to fall prey here, as I probably will fall prey at every one of our stops along the way, to saying surely this is the most fascinating period in the religion of ancient Israel, because what folks asked at this time was the following. You know, we no longer have any political independence. We're part of somebody else's empire now. We are not our own nation. We're not in control of our own political destiny. Is it conceivable that even in the absence of our own political independence, we can stick to our old religion? Now, that's not a question that anybody in the ancient Near East had asked before. Everybody presumed that a religion went with a nation state. And if you were incorporated in somebody else's empire, then your religion became that religion. And after the Israelite exile, somebody asked the all-important question, even though we're not a distinct political independent entity anymore, can we continue the religion of our fathers? And obviously that's a rhetorical question in retrospect, because the answer was, you bet your boots. Second major thing I want to do today, and probably that upon which we'll spend more time than any other single issue, is to ask, as I said earlier today, what is, I know, a fairly obvious, perhaps even an insulting, though I hope you won't find my answer insulting, question, and that is the question, what is the Old Testament? I'm putting in Hebrew Bible in parentheses on the sheets in front of you so that you'll know whether I'm talking about Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. I'm talking about the same document. So too, by the way, when I talk about dates before the modern era, before the era of Christianity, I'm usually going to call them BC. That is, after all, the convention. But occasionally I'll say BCE, just because I happen to think BCE at the moment. BCE means before the Common Era, and it's the same date. It's just a different and less specifically Christian way of indicating a date. But I myself grew up as a Christian. I'm certainly most familiar with the terminology BC, so I will use BC. You don't need a Celsius Fahrenheit kind of guide to translate BCE to BC. If Jerusalem fell and the exile happened in 587 BC, then Jerusalem fell and the exile happened in 587 BCE. If Hammurabi, the king of ancient Babylon, began to reign in 1790 BCE, then Hammurabi began to reign in 1790 BC. So it's the same dates. You don't need any kind of a conversion formula, just a different way of talking about that. We have to ask this question, what is the Old Testament? Because the Old Testament is a particularly interesting and a particularly complex kind of document. It is most centrally, as I say on the sheets in front of you, a document that is a collection of once independent documents from many hands and from many periods. There are parts of the Old Testament, there are independent poems, as you will see, as old as the beginning of the people Israel. There is material in the Hebrew Bible as old as about the beginning of the Iron Age, which is 1200 BC. And I'll tell you which ones of those there are before we're finished. There are also parts of the Old Testament from after the Maccabean Revolt, from 150 years, 180 years in fact, after Alexander the Great, from the 2nd century BC. And I'll tell you which ones those are before we're finished. That is to say, the material in the Old Testament spans a full 1,000 years, from about 1200 BC to after 200 BC, and that's a long, long time. The period that separates the oldest from the most recent materials in the Hebrew Bible is significantly longer than the period that separates Chaucer from us, significantly longer than the time that separates Magna Carta from the latest constitutional amendment. 1,000 years is a long time, and that's how long it took the Hebrew Bible to be composed. Now, as such, as a collection, obviously what the Hebrew Bible is an anthology. And it's an anthology of works from a whole lot of different people over a whole lot of different times. And that ought to be fairly clear. I, after all, am used to anthologies. When I took English 5 and 6 when I was an undergraduate, we had the Norton Anthology of English Literature. And some of you may have read the Norton or other anthologies of literature, but there's a big difference, and that's the following. If you're reading English literature and your chief source book is something like the Norton Anthology, when you come to Edmund Spenser, there's going to be a bit of modern prose that says, listen, O audience, we have ceased to talk about the preceding poet, and now we're going to give you some examples of Edmund Spenser, who was born about 1540, who went to Merchant Taylor's School in London and then went to Pembroke College, Cambridge. And no, I don't know the Oxford and Cambridge colleges of every English poet, but I went to Pembroke College, Cambridge, and one of the things I do know is that Edmund Spenser graduated from Pembroke College, Cambridge in 1561, and then it'll tell you something about what Edmund Spenser wrote. And then there'll be another introduction before you get to Sir Philip Sidney, and then another introduction before you get to George Herbert, and one before John Donne, and one before Dryden, and one before Pope, and one before, so you know what to expect. The Hebrew Bible is an anthology without those explanatory introductions. There are 2 verses sitting together in the Hebrew Bible that can come 7 or 8 centuries apart in their time of composition. We'll sometimes see a verse from the Hebrew Bible, which is to be dated to the 12th century, sitting right next to a verse which is to be dated to the 7th or the 6th century, and it doesn't look like using.
If you're reading a Hebrew Bible in, for example, the RSV, Revised Standard Version, which is a 1948 revision of a later version, which is a revision of the Authorized Version, which was published in 1611, you're reading homogenized 1948 English prose. And it doesn't look like this stuff comes centuries apart. Well, of course not, because you're reading it in a translation of a translation. If you're reading it in Hebrew, it'd be a lot clearer. So the reason why we have to talk about this material as specifically we do as a collection is that though it's an anthology, it's an odd one from our way of looking at things, because we get these verses from very different hands and from very different periods, and nobody's there to tell us in the text itself that this comes from a different person in a different period. We're going to do it this way. We're going to say that it's very important to look at when this material was written and by whom and for whom, because a presupposition of this course, not a necessary one, and I'll give you some alternatives, but a presupposition of this course is that the historical and social context of biblical literature is the most important thing for us to know. That it makes all the difference in the world to know when something was written, to know for whom it was written, and to know why it was written. Now, I want to make sure that you understand what I'm saying, and I'll contrast it with a couple of other things. There's a very interesting thing that one can do that's not our task, that's the following. You can say, what did the Hebrew Bible mean to post-biblical Judaism? How did the rabbis who were responsible for the Talmud, how are the rabbis who were responsible for the flowering of medieval Jewish literature? How does modern Judaism read the Hebrew Bible? That's an interesting task. It's not ours. You can ask, what does Christianity make of what it calls the Old Testament? How did St. Paul? How did Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, and others who wrote the New Testament? How did St. Augustine? How did Aquinas? How did Martin Luther? How did John Calvin? How did any number of Christian figures read what they call the Old Testament? And how did they interpret this religion as a necessary predecessor to what they see as the triumphant religion of Christianity? That's a very interesting task, but it's not ours. You could do the same thing with Islam. How does the religion of Islam, began in the 6th century, regard the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, and what does it make of it? That also is not our question. Our question is, what did the religion of Israel mean to the people who experienced it? Those other questions are interesting subsequent questions. What did it mean to later Judaism? How was it interpreted by Christianity? What do Muslims make of it? But they're not our questions. Our questions are, what did the religion of Israel mean to the people who experienced it? Rather than talking vaguely, as I have been so far, about the growth of the Hebrew Bible as something that took 1,000 years, I want to give you a very specific example of how the Hebrew Bible grew, and I want to do that by looking at the shape of the story that I've called the epic. Now, earlier you heard me say that the epic is the title that I'm going to give to the main story that starts
with creation, and then the patriarchs, and then Moses, and then Israel in Egypt, and then Israel out of Egypt until they get to the land of Canaan. And what I want to do is read in one case and describe for you in another case a couple of documents, one very early in Israelite history and one very late in Israelite history, that talk about that story. Because I think you will learn much better than I could descriptively account for you. You will learn something about the growth of the Hebrew Bible in this way. The first one of them, and I think I put it on the sheets in front of you, and I have, is Deuteronomy 26, 5 through 9. So I'm going to read for you Deuteronomy 26, 5 through 9. If you're wondering what version of the Hebrew Bible I'm using, again, I'm not. I will translate as I go. There are any number of wonderful translations of the Old Testament today, so I'm not going to chastise you, any of you, for whatever one you've got. The New English Bible is great. I still love the RSV because it captures some of the cadences of the miraculous translation, the authorized version of the King James Version, which is as beautifully as English has ever been written, and certainly as beautifully as English has ever been translated. But the New American Bible, there are lots of great Bibles, but biblical translators take their task very seriously, and there's almost nothing that I would condemn. See, whenever I read a Hebrew Bible, such chunk from the Hebrew Bible, by the way, I do 2 or 3 sentences of fill-in so that you can all find the passage. So what I've just said, I hope, instructed you about biblical translations, but I also try to do it to make sure you can find the passage in case you would like to read with me. And I'm going to read you parts of Deuteronomy 26, 5 through 9. It has a ritual or a cultic background. This tells you what you're supposed to do when you bring an offering to the priest. And what you're supposed to do is say the following. So this thing is not something that pops into somebody's head. It's the equivalent of a Christian creed. It's what somebody says on a set religious or set sacrificial or set cultic occasion. Deuteronomy 26, 5. And you will answer and you will say before the Lord your God, a perishing, a dying, a doomed Aramean was my father. Your Bibles, many of them will say a wandering Aramean was my father. Well, it really does mean dying. But so a perishing, except perishing has that darn perishing Aramean. In English, perishing also has an unhappy sense, so I guess I better say a doomed. A doomed Aramean was my father. And he went down into Egypt, and he wandered about there, few in number. And there he became a great nation, mighty and numerous. But the Egyptians treated us badly, and they afflicted us, and they laid upon us harsh labor. So we cried out unto the Lord, the God of our fathers, and God heard our cry, and he saw the bad things we were undergoing, and he saw our toil and our oppression. So the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and with an outstretched arm and with signs and with great terror and with signs and with wonders, and he brought us into this place, and he gave to us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Okay? That's the story of the first part of the Hebrew Bible in an early summary of it. And it's got 3 themes. The ancient patriarch Jacob, because Jacob is an Aramean, so we know that the doomed Aramean is Jacob. An ancient patriarch Jacob, the fact that this ancient patriarch Jacob went down into Egypt, and that there was an exodus from Egypt, and thirdly, the fact of the conquest of the land of Israel. Now, if I were then to read for you, and there isn't time for me to do this, so I hope you'll do it yourselves, a long confession in Nehemiah 9, you would find the following. This confession, with 3 themes, Patriarch Jacob, into Egypt and out of Egypt, getting the land of Israel, it comes from a very early period in Israelite religion. Let's call it 1100 B.C. If you were then to read the confession of what God did for Israel in Nehemiah 9, which comes from a very late period, the 5th or the 4th century, more likely the 4th century B.C., you would find that the confession covers the same period but has 6 themes. Not 3, but 6. I'm not going to read it for you, but do it sometime. Read Nehemiah 9, and that's actually Nehemiah 9, 6 through 37. Those themes are first, creation. The God whom Israel worshiped created the world. Deuteronomy 26 didn't say anything about God as a creator. Didn't attribute any creation to the God of Israel. This one does. Secondly, you get to the patriarchal period, But you'd begin not with Jacob, but this time with Abraham, 2 generations before. The story's been expanded. So the first patriarch is not Jacob. It's not even Jacob's father, Isaac. It's Jacob's grandfather, Abraham. Thirdly, you get in Nehemiah 9 to the period in Egypt, but you'd find the story massively expanded. Not just that Israel suffered bondage in Egypt, but that there were 10 plagues, there was the Passover, there was the slaying of the firstborn. The coming out of Egypt wasn't just a military victory. It was making a wall with water on the left and water on the right, with the Israelites walking on dry land in the middle. Fourthly, you get another entirely new theme, the theme of Moses and the reception of the Torah or the law or divine instruction on top of Mount Sinai. Fifthly, another new theme, the theme of wandering and rebelling in the wilderness between the time in Egypt and the time in taking the land. And then fifthly, you get to the conquest. And that's it. And that's what you should learn from this. Look at one summary of what God has done for Israel from the early period of Israel, and you get 3 very brief themes. Look at another summary of what God has done for Israel from 700 years later, and you get 6 massively elaborated themes. The shape of the Hebrew Bible as we now have it is the same as the shape of Nehemiah 9. So the shape of the Hebrew Bible as we've got it is a shape that this material assumed sometime in the progress of those centuries between the 12th and the 4th. Centuries of elaboration, centuries of separate tribes making their contributions, centuries of new and new data added to the story. Now, in about 5 minutes, I'm going to give you 5 or 7 an outline history of Israel. Can I possibly give you an outline history of Israel in 5 minutes? I can, if and only if you will understand the following. Everything that I'm going to say in concluding Lecture 1, you will hear again. You may hear it in slightly different prose. None of us likes to repeat himself, absolutely. You may hear it like that Syrian poetry that I talked about earlier that says one thing and then says the same thing in different language. But everything that I say here, you're going to hear again. This is once over lightly so that the second and the third time it may seem a little bit more clear. Israelite history begins in what we call the patriarchal period, and the patriarchs are set, according to the Hebrew Bible itself, in a period that we would call, as modern students of the ancient Near East, the Middle Bronze period, in something like the 18th to the 15th centuries B.C. And in this period, we do know there were people who wandered over the land of Israel and wandered in that territory between Egypt and Mesopotamia, who were what we would call ass nomads or semi-nomads. That means they weren't authentic full nomads because the camel had not yet been domesticated, nor would it be until about the beginning of the Iron Age in 1200, but they wandered sometimes and they settled down sometimes. And the Hebrew Bible says just that about them. Sometimes they stayed a place for a long time, and someplace they wandered about. According to the Hebrew Bible, some of these at one point, the children of Jacob and then Jacob himself, wandered down into Egypt. That's not implausible historically. And it's not implausible historically because in this period, about 1500 and before BC, there were a group of Asians. Asians mean, from the standpoint of Egypt, anybody to the east of Egypt, obviously. There were a group of Asians who were in control of Egypt, and therefore Egypt was particularly welcoming to the kind of people who the patriarchs were. Exodus and conquest. Hebrew Bible then says that there was a mighty, that the Pharaoh treated them harshly, and that there was a mighty flight out of Egypt due to the response of God, and that they conquered the land of Canaan. That, too, is not improbable. It's not improbable because while at one period Egypt was welcoming of Asians, and another period the Egyptians didn't want any Asians living there, and they expelled all of the Asians. And it may well be that among the groups whom they expelled was a small group who later became part of one of the 12 tribes of Israel. The period of the Tribal League is the period to which we're going to get momentarily, and again, it's 200 years when tribal loyalties predominated, when there was an entity that we can call Israel, but when there wasn't anything like a king or a monarchy. The 100 years following that, from 1022 to 922 BC, the era of what we call the United Monarchy, and that means all of Israel was under a single king. And we'll follow the way in which Israel made a development from a tribal league to a king, and then we'll see that Israel's first three kings are Saul, David, and Solomon. And we call this the United Monarchy because it means everything that was Israel in the tribal league period was united under a single king. There was only one king of all of Israel. And we call it that also to distinguish it from the period that comes after it, because the period that comes after it is what we call the divided monarchy. After 922, formerly united Israel was never again a single nation. It was always two nations, the nation of Judah in the south and the nation of Israel, or Ephraim, in the north. After 922, Israel is united under a monarchy for a very brief period, only for 100 years. For most of the existence of this nation, it's two nations, the nation of Judah in the south and the nation of Israel, or Ephraim, in the north. And we will see there are distinctive and very interesting ideological differences between these two entities. One of them ends in 722 when the Assyrians capture the northern kingdom of Israel. The second one, the nation of Judah, ends in 587 when the Neo-Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar, captures Judah in 587, and that's the end of political independence for Judah. All of this history we'll go through again, and as we go through it, systematically we'll talk about the religious response to these vitally important historical events.
The Gospels of Mark and Matthew. Let's have a look now at what biblical scholars have to tell us about the possible authorship, dates, sources, audience, characteristics, and the reason for writing of these two documents. Matthew, Mark, and Luke's Gospel together are known as the Synoptic Gospels. The word synoptic simply means can be seen together. They're all very much alike, mainly because both Luke and Matthew copied from Mark. It used to be thought that Matthew's was the first gospel written and that Mark's was simply a synopsis of his gospel. And you realize that when you look in your Bibles and see Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that it really should be the other way. It should be Mark, and then Matthew and Luke together, and then John. All of the Gospels are attempts to tell us who Jesus was. And we will notice in the time together we have this afternoon that there is a development that occurs as we look first at Mark's Gospel and then a further development in the church's understanding of who Jesus was by the time we get to Matthew and Luke, and still a further understanding when we get to John, who has a much more advanced Christology. The word gospel means good news, and the word evangelist means one who spreads the good news. Present scholarship suggests that all of the stories about Jesus circulated in the form of oral tradition for about 4 decades. That is, that stories about him, what he had done, the miracles, etc., were simply passed on by word of mouth, mainly through the charismatic apostles. The apostles, however, were now beginning to die off. By about the year 63, we know that persecution in the church had started. Then later on, there is the destruction of the temple at Jerusalem, and it really does seem to many that the world was coming to an end. And yet the Parousia, that is the imminent return of Jesus, had not happened. We do know persecution had started. Tacitus tells us that. And at the same time, Gentiles were also pouring into the church. Paul had carried the message of Jesus out into the Gentile world. And of course, Paul's letters we had in existence. But nonetheless, there was a panic situation when people began to die off, and it was felt that these stories could be lost forever. So it seems to have been at this point that the Gospels began to be written. In fact, the word gospel, as I said, means good news, and it wasn't a new invention. Roman emperors would have heralds go around declaring the gospel, good news about the emperor. The emperor has won such and such a battle. The emperor has a new grandchild. Good news about the emperor was circulated by heralds, and this was called a gospel. But scholars seem to think that the gospel as a narrative, as a long story, was maybe invented by Mark. Now, who was this Mark? The thing is, we really don't know who he was. Mark was the most common name at the time in the Roman Empire. It would be like writing a book today and saying at the end of it, this book was written by Bill. Who would know which Bill wrote it? There are a lot of guesses as to the identity of the person who wrote this gospel. He may well have been a companion of Paul and Barnabas. We do know that Barnabas had a young cousin called Mark. In fact, he went on travels, do you remember, with Paul and Barnabas, and then he got homesick and he had to come back. And then Paul, next time he's going, Barnabas says, well, let's take Mark, and Paul just says, no way, we're not going to try taking him again. It could possibly have been this person. It may also have been, in the Acts of the Apostles, it says that the early church used to meet in the home of a person called John Mark. John is the Hebrew name, Mark is the Greek name. It could have been that young man whose home was open to the early Christians. If it was, then his sources would have been, he would have known people who knew Jesus and possibly knew Jesus himself. Others say that it could have been a young man who is mentioned in the Gospel of Mark in chapter 14. He mentions that when Jesus was arrested, there was a young man standing there in the garden, and that they pulled off his cloak and he ran away naked. Now, he's only mentioned in Mark's Gospel. The others, even though they copy Mark, don't pick up that little story. Some have suggested, well, possibly this was the Mark who wrote the Gospel. I think that's unlikely. I mean, if that had happened to me, I wouldn't be likely to include it in whatever I wrote. Others think that he was a disciple of Peter's. In fact, we're told that by some of the early churchmen. Papias, who was a 2nd century bishop in Asia Minor, does tell us that he was an interpreter for Peter. This could well have been the case, because when you're reading through Mark's Gospel, Peter never comes out well. It's as though a man is never a hero to his butler. He knew Peter so well that he doesn't really seem to say anything nice about him. He tells us, for instance, that Jesus comes back when he's undergoing the agony in the garden and says to him, Simon, couldn't you even wait 1 hour with me? Later on, he tells us that Peter denies Jesus 3 times. And Peter's the one who complains, Lord, we've left everything to follow you. What should we be getting as a result of this? But most scholars would probably say that Mark's Gospel was connected, at least, to the teaching of Peter. What were his sources? Well, again, if he had been any of these people, he would have known people who had known Jesus, or possibly he himself had even known him. The date of Mark's Gospel is usually given as the year 70. The reason for that is in chapter 13 of Mark, it seems to allude to the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem, which had happened in the year 70. So he seems to allude to it. There are others who think, no, that isn't about the destruction of the temple, and others put his gospel back as early as perhaps the year 63, because we know that persecution started in the year 63, and it's obvious that in Mark's gospel he's writing for people who were undergoing persecution. They were Gentiles, many of these people in Rome, who were suffering under the persecution of Nero, perhaps. So how do we know they were Gentiles that Mark addresses his gospel to? Though I'm sure that there were Jews among them too, because there usually were among all groups of Christians. But Mark explains a lot of Jewish customs to them. I mean, he will tell them something like Isaiah the prophet. Well, a Jewish person would know that Isaiah was a prophet. He will talk about Capernaum in Galilee. Well, if you were Jewish, you would know that Capernaum was in Galilee. He calls Jesus the Son of Man rather than the Son of David, which is a term that his Jewish audience would relate to. So these were probably Gentile, and we know they were being persecuted because there is so much suffering that is mentioned in the Gospel of Mark. He has Jesus say things like, "He who loses his life for me will save it. My disciples must take up their cross daily and follow me." And when John and James come to Jesus and ask him for special favors, Jesus' reply to them is, "Can you drink of the cup that I will drink of?" He also has him say, "The Son of Man came to give his life as a ransom for many." Why was it written? Well, it was written to console these Gentiles who were undergoing persecution, and to give them to a further explanation of who Jesus was. Mark does this in very subtle ways. He relates his audience to Jesus. In the temptation scene of Mark's Gospel, he tells us that Jesus was with the wild beasts. Now, the others, even though they copy Mark, leave that out. They never mention Jesus was with the wild beasts. It's only mentioned in Mark. Why? Well, these people who were being persecuted in Rome were being thrown to the wild beasts. They were put in the arena to fight with wild animals, so they could relate to this Jesus who was with the wild beasts. He presents a Jesus who is suffering, a Jesus who's misunderstood, a Jesus who's abandoned, and a Jesus, too, who is always fighting against the forces of evil. The major theme in Mark's Gospel is that Jesus is the expected Messiah of the Jews, and he is one who establishes a kingdom, but he is a suffering Messiah, and the kingdom that he establishes is one where the forces of evil were curtailed. It's not a territorial kingdom, as many had expected it might be. And the messiahship of Jesus in Mark's Gospel always remains a mystery all through the Markan narrative. Jesus himself seems to know that he is the Messiah, but he doesn't want other people to know about it just yet. Every time there is a miracle, that Jesus performs a miracle in Mark's Gospel, he says, "Don't tell anybody. Keep this a secret." Whenever there is a sign of glory in Mark's Gospel, there's a sign of suffering. When Peter says to Jesus, "You are the Messiah," Jesus starts talking about the suffering Messiah, that I will have to suffer because I am the Messiah. And Peter, of course, says, oh, no, you're not going to have to suffer, not the Messiah. And Jesus says to him, get behind me, Satan. I know I've got to suffer. At his trial before the Sanhedrin, it is here that he only admits, when they say to him, are you the Messiah? He says, yes, I am. And this puts the lid on everything for him. He is condemned to death for saying this. I have my own little thesis about why Jesus wanted to keep his messiahship secret in Mark's Gospel. This past summer, I took a group of students over to an archaeological dig in Israel. One of the sites that we visited while we were there was a place called Gomla. It isn't mentioned in Scripture, and most people have never heard of it. But Gomla, according to our friend Josephus, was a town in which many zealots lived. In fact, he suggests that the Jewish revolt against Rome had started here at Gomla. We do know that during the war, with the Roman war, 5,000 people committed suicide at Gomla. But if Gomla was in fact a zealot town, and many expected that the Messiah, when he came, would be a military leader, somebody who was able to establish more power for them, many might well have thought that the Messiah was going to be a zealot, and that Jesus did not want himself to be associated with this idea that he was a zealot who was going to establish his kingdom in that way. That, of course, is simply my own thesis, which was formed this summer. In any event, the Jews were not expecting a suffering Messiah. No way. It was quite unexpected. Paul calls it a stumbling block for the Jews, a folly to the Greeks, but power and wisdom for Christians. Christians, in this case, being Mark's audience. It would give them power and wisdom. They could relate to this Jesus that Mark presents. He's a Jesus who knows all the way through that he has to suffer, and he doesn't like it. Mark uses terms like he was filled with fear, he was filled with distress. He has difficulty completing his role. He knows he has a job to do, but he doesn't want to go through with it. He pleads with his Father, take this cup away from me. I'd much rather not do it. He feels abandoned, just as his audience may well have felt abandoned by everybody. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me? There isn't anything nice in Mark about the death of Jesus. You know, you find when you come to Luke, when he talks about the crucifixion, it's not that bad. He has Jesus up there on the cross, and Jesus is able to talk to the penitent thief. He's able to forgive his murderers. That doesn't happen in Mark's gospel. He has a Jesus nailed there who is screaming. He dies as a screaming man who's going through hell. He's going through this terrible torture. He feels abandoned by everybody. All through Mark's gospel, Jesus is misunderstood and rejected. Even his own family in Mark's gospel want to put him away. When he speaks in parables, and Mark tells us that Jesus always taught in parables, his disciples are completely flabbergasted. They don't understand what he says, and Jesus has to go and explain things for them. Everything needs to be explained about what Jesus has to say. This, of course, could well reflect the state of the church at the time. Were they in a state of confusion, the early church itself, where everything needed to be explained to them? Possibly. This is a Jesus, too, who always wins over the forces of evil. There are lots of exorcisms in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus is always casting out devils, evil spirits. He even at one point has a head-on fight with the scribes who accuse him of being possessed by a devil. But Mark also presents a Jesus who is in command. It's a Jesus who is very authoritative. He's not like the scribes, they will say. He says things like, who can this be that even the winds and the sea obey him? He has Jesus walking along by the Sea of Galilee and seeing fishermen there and saying, just come follow me. And they drop everything to go after him. Now, I've walked along the Sea of Galilee myself and wondered, would I go following somebody like this? You would need to have an enormous amount of authority and charism before two people like James and John, whose father owned a whole fleet of fishing vessels, we're told. They dropped everything, the whole family business, threw it over just to follow this preacher. So it is a Jesus who had great authority and great charism. He tells us he speaks with authority, not like one of the scribes. He says things that others wouldn't dare say, like the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And he's also eschatologically focused. We were talking about eschatology yesterday. It was an idea that the end times were to come, and when the end times came, then a reign of justice will begin. Mark presents a Jesus who seems to be aware that those end times are about to start. There's a great sense of urgency about his Jesus. He wants to do things quickly, get it all over and done with. Let's do this before the end times are on us. He has Jesus moving round all the time, tells us things like he withdrew to the lake, then he went up into the mountain, then he went into Capernaum, and he's hardly had time to get in there when suddenly he appears somewhere else. He appears in Galilee. He made his way along the Sea of Galilee. He came to Capernaum again. He went into Bethsaida. He was walking through the standing grain. He withdrew to a lake. He returned to this house. He went to Caesarea Philippi. It's a Jesus who was constantly on the move. And many of these places were a long way from each other. If you ever go over to Israel, you will realize that, to go from one place to another would have taken you quite some time. But he has a Jesus who's constantly moving round. If Jesus ever stopped to catch his breath, Mark just doesn't tell us about that. On the other hand, so much for the portrait he presents of Jesus. What about the characteristics of Mark's gospel? Well, people tell us it's written in poor Greek. It is written, it has sophisticated concepts, and yet it is very unpolished. His style is very unpolished. Some people have compared it to the writings of Hemingway. Sophisticated ideas, but told in a very simple way. He uses a lot of tautology. Mark will say things like, Jesus was at home with his kin. Well, usually if you're at home, you are with your kin. He would say it was morning after sunrise. Well, it's never morning till after sunrise. He talks about the elect, the chosen ones. Well, if you're elect, you're a chosen one. Evening at sundown. Well, yes, evening comes after sundown. He mentions lepers and says these lepers were unclean. Of course they were unclean. If you were a leper, you were unclean. This is characteristic. You can always tell when you're with Mark's gospel because of these little bits he puts in. He also begins with his conclusions, and then he goes on to prove them. He starts out his gospel by saying, this is the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And then at the very end, he has that centurion, when Jesus died, say, truly, this man was the Son of God. There are, incidentally, two endings to Mark's gospel. It's the shortest of the gospels. It's only 16 chapters. But it seems to end at chapter 16, verse 9, with the resurrection. But then there are other verses added on, and scholars think possibly they were added on much later after the appearance of Matthew and Luke, chapters 9 to 20, where he talks about Jesus' appearance to Mary Magdalene and his appearance to the disciples on their way into the country, and talks about the ascension and the start of the apostolic mission. So much for Mark. Let's just catch our breath now and move over to Matthew, and we'll ask the same questions about Matthew as we've asked about Mark. To begin with, who was he? He was not Matthew the Apostle. If he were Matthew the Apostle, he would not need to have relied on the Gospel of Mark to the extent that he did rely on it. But there was a tradition that arose in the 2nd century that said that this Matthew, remember Matthew was a tax collector who was the apostle, possibly had written down sayings of Jesus that were in circulation, and this may well have been one of the sources used by the author of this gospel. His sources, I've already told you, he used Mark. He had his own particular sources. There are several stories that turn up in Matthew that aren't in any others. The story of the Syro-Phoenician woman, for instance, the story about the laborers in the vineyard. A lot of the kingdom pronouncements are only in Matthew's gospel and aren't in others. The M source, just M standing for Matthew. And then there is another source that he had. Several things show up in Luke's gospel. They also show up in Matthew's gospel, and scholars say that they both drew on the same source. They're mainly sayings of Jesus, and we call this the Q source, simply from the German word Quelle, which means source. There are a number of scholars who are now trying to find this hypothetical document, the Q source. Was it written down? Did the followers of Jesus write down his sayings fairly soon after his death? And was this kept somewhere? When I was in Bethsaida this year, one of the Q people was there looking to see if we might dig up the Q document. I mean, it's a far out idea, but nonetheless, so many things have been dug up in the last 50 years or so that it could be a possibility. We didn't find any Q document. And actually, the last day of the dig when we were there, I had taken over a rock from my own backyard, which I was going to put at Bethsaida. I do odd things like that to confuse future archaeologists. And on the last day of the dig, a group of students and myself got this rock and we wrote a great big Q on it and put it into the wall for the next set of people to find it. So possibly there was a document in existence called the Q source about the sayings of Jesus. Why did Matthew write his gospel? What was it written in response to? Well, Jerusalem had been destroyed by the Romans in the year 70, as we know already, and Judaism was being given new life. We noted earlier a great deal of diversity in Judaism in that first century, but after about the year 70, we find that most forms of Judaism are dying out. Only Pharisaic Judaism seems to have survived the catastrophe of 70. So it was being given new direction by the Pharisees in a little town called Jomnia, which is south of present-day Tel Aviv. Eventually, these people would establish a liturgical calendar. They would define synagogue worship, and there was going to be no more sacrifice because the temple was destroyed. And they would eventually, by the year 90, establish a canon of scripture. And in the year 92, we understand that they no longer allowed this other sect of within Judaism, Christian Judaism, to worship in their synagogue. They did not allow them in. And we find that for that 20 years, between about the year 70 and 90, there is a growing antagonism between these two sects within Judaism. A great deal of tension exists between these two groups, And Matthew seems to have written his gospel for the Jewish Christians. They were feeling rejected because they were no longer welcome in the synagogue. His gospel was probably written about the year 85. These people saw themselves still as Jews and only with the added dimension of Jesus. Well, Gentile Christians were also beginning to pour into the church by this time, and laws were being relaxed for these people. There was a certain feeling among the Jewish Christians, perhaps, why should these people be allowed in and have all of the laws that have been so important to us relaxed just for them? Well, Matthew wants to show his audience, look, this is how the situation is. There is no going back. Jesus is the fulfillment of Judaism, and we cannot go back. The major theme in Matthew's Gospel, in fact, is that Jesus is the Messiah. He is the fulfillment of Jewish expectations. Judaism has reached fulfillment in Jesus, and there is no way of returning to any other form of Judaism, according to Matthew. Matthew, incidentally, was probably writing at Antioch in Syria. He wasn't done in Jamnia. He was in Antioch. We know that there would have been a sizable Jewish population here and also several Gentiles. We've already mentioned one Antioch in Galatia. There's another Antioch in Syria. That's an important city. The reason there's so many Antiochs around was a gentleman we mentioned yesterday, Antiochus IV, who was that Greek who put a statue of Zeus in the temple in Jerusalem. He was sort of a person who liked his own name attached to the ends of towns. So he called many towns after himself. So you've got Antiochs showing up all over the place here. Okay, Matthew then presents Jesus as the fulfillment of Judaism and as their expected Messiah. We've mentioned that Messiah, the word Messiah, means anointed one. And three types of people were anointed: kings, prophets, and kings, prophets, and who were the others? Kings, prophets, and priests were anointed. Now, Matthew puts in this very subtly in his infancy narrative. You remember that he tells us some people came to visit Jesus when he was born, and they brought him gifts. You remember what the gifts were? They brought him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Gold is associated with a king. Frankincense would be associated with priest. Myrrh, it's a bitter herb, would have been associated with a prophet. And this is how Matthew says, whatever type of Messiah you were expecting, Jesus is it. Some of the characteristics of his gospel, well, he's very down on Pharisees. It is an anti-Jewish gospel. He regards the Pharisees as being the whole of a problem for the audience he addresses. He presents a Jesus who is often in conflict with Pharisees. He goes on, never says a single nice word about the Pharisees. Woe to you, Pharisees, you shall not enter the kingdom of heaven. He says things like, when the Pharisees were outside, they began to plot. Beware the leaven of the Pharisees. There are 7 denouncements of the Pharisees just in chapter 23. He says, you scribes and Pharisees, you frauds, you ignore weighty matters. You strain on the gnat and swallow the camel. You shut the door to the kingdom of heaven in men's faces. You are like whitewashed tombs, beautiful to look at on the outside, but inside filled with filth and dead men's bones. He calls them, you brood of vipers. he doesn't really like Pharisees. In Matthew's Gospel, it is the Pharisees who ask Pilate to put a guard at the tomb of Jesus. The others don't do that, incidentally. So he never, if Jesus ever had any kind word to say about Pharisees, certainly Matthew doesn't record it. On the other hand, there was resentment among his community about so many Gentiles coming into the church. And Gentiles in Matthew's Gospel all turn out very well. There are two infancy narratives, that we have. We have Luke's infancy narrative and we have Matthew's infancy narrative. In Matthew's narrative, he says the first people to come and recognize Jesus when he's born weren't Jewish at all. They were men who came from the east. They were Gentiles. So the Gentiles were the first to recognize Jesus. He gives us the story of the centurion servant. You remember the centurion? Of course, others give it too, but he has a different little slant on it. He has the centurion come to Jesus and say, my servant is sick. Could you come and cure him? And Jesus, of course, says, yes, of course I'll come. But he's aware, the centurion is aware, that Jews did not generally enter the home of a Gentile. And so the centurion says, Lord, I am not worthy that you should enter my house. Just say the word, and my servant will be healed. And Jesus replies to the centurion, who is a Gentile, I have not found faith like this in Israel. In other words, faith is found among the Gentiles. He does the same thing with the Syrophoenician woman, who is also a Gentile. Maybe she has a sick daughter, and she comes and asks for this daughter to be cured. And Jesus said, well, I'm first sent to the house of Israel. And she replies, look, I'll take anything that's left over. Any of the leavings left over. What the house of Israel doesn't want, I will accept. And Jesus turns to her and says, woman, you have great faith. Faith is found with the Gentiles in Matthew's Gospel. He has, again, the Roman soldier recognized Jesus as the Son of God. He's the only one, too, who gives us the parable of the two sons working in the vineyard. Remember, they asked one person to go out, and he said he would go, but he didn't go. And then they asked the other and said, I won't go, but he does go. Here, Matthew is presenting again Jews and Gentiles. He also gives the parable of the wedding feast. Go out into the highways and the byways. The people that we invited in haven't come. They are not coming to the feast, so let's go out and bring in others, possibly meaning Gentiles. And that he ends his gospel by saying, go teach.
Emphasis in Matthew's Gospel where he
contrasts Jesus with the Pharisees, who are teachers. He presents Jesus as a great teacher in the same way as Moses was. Moses was the teacher par excellence, and he presents Jesus as the new Moses. Remember, Moses had received the law on Mount Sinai. Matthew has Jesus give a new law on the Sermon on the Mount. It's on a mountain again, where he gives the sermon, which include the 8 Beatitudes. You know, Luke gives that same sermon, but he's not interested in making Jesus a new Moses. He says the sermon was given on a level place, because it wasn't important to Luke's audience to associate Jesus with Moses. He gives Jesus, who is thoroughly rooted in Judaism. He calls him son of David, and he traces the genealogy of Jesus in his infancy narratives back to Abraham. Abraham was the progenitor of the Hebrew people. It's interesting, you know, people so often skip over that. If you're reading genealogies, they skip over the genealogy of Jesus. It's very interesting to read. There were 4 rather shady women who are mentioned here. He mentions Tamar and Rahab, who really had rather questionable pasts. He mentions Ruth, who was a fine woman, but she wasn't Jewish, she was a Moabite woman. And he mentions Bathsheba, who was, of course, an adulteress. So it's interesting to read through the genealogy of Jesus. I suppose we all have a few skeletons in our closet. He has Jesus redo in his own lifetime everything that had happened to the Jews. They came out of Egypt, so did he. When Jesus was born, there was a wicked King Herod trying to kill babies. When Moses was born, there was a wicked Pharaoh who was also trying to kill babies. Jesus becomes the new Exodus in Matthew's Gospel. He is always using quotations from the prophets, particularly Isaiah, to show that Jesus was the fulfillment of all of their expectations. Jesus spent 40 days at his temptation, just as the Israelites had spent 40 days in the desert. Incidentally, whenever you read about numbers in the New Testament, remember they're simply symbols. Probably 40 means a generation. Doesn't mean that there were 40 years, but 40 is a generation, or 40 days would be a time in which to get regenerated. So he presents Jesus then as being thoroughly rooted in Judaism. He's a great teacher on a par with Moses. He is the new Moses. He gives us the scene of the Transfiguration, where Jesus goes up to the top of Mount Tabor, and he's seen there with Moses and with Elijah. Moses representing the law, Elijah representing the prophets. And he says that the apostles, there were just 3 of them with him, looked at the face of Jesus, and it was radiant, just exactly describing it as was Moses described when he came down from the top of Mount Sinai. I've been to both of those mountains, and I really was struck by the similarity there is there. From the top of Mount Tabor, you can see everywhere. You can see Nazareth, you can see the Sea of Galilee, you can see the Mediterranean. You can see all of these places that were associated with Jesus. Years ago, I climbed to the top of the Sinai, Mount Sinai, with one of my children, climbed up very early in the morning to see the sunrise. It was just a tremendous experience, waiting there in the cold and shivering dark for the sun to come up. And you watched, and suddenly it came over the horizon, very, very wobbly at first, you know, and you kept clicking your camera before it got so bright that you couldn't see anything. And then suddenly there's this big ball of fire, and you look all round, and all of Mount Sinai, you see colors of reds and purples and pinks all over, and all of a sudden you can see everything. It had been dark and cold. Now you can see back, you can see the Red Sea, you can see back into Egypt, you can see over to the Promised Land. It was just a tremendous experience. In any event, these 2 mountains, I felt there was a great feeling, at least for me, of their being so akin to each other. So then Matthew, in his Gospel, presents Jesus as fulfilling everything that the Jews were expecting at the time. Whatever sort of Messiah they were expecting, he is here. This was it. He is a Jesus who repeats in his own life all of their experiences. Coming out of Egypt, yes, he went into Egypt. The others never mention that Jesus went into Egypt. He went into Egypt as a baby and came out. Constant referring to the Old Testament to show that Jesus was a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies. He is trying to tell his audience, who were wondering, should we go back? Should we go in the direction of rabbinic Judaism? Is it possible for us to do that? he is trying to convince these people that there is no way to do that Jesus has been the fulfillment for them, and that once they have encountered him, there is no going back. For Matthew, Judaism has matured in Jesus, and he leaves it to another to present a Jesus who will appeal to Gentiles.